All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started with the report out. And I want to talk just a little bit about the timeline associated with the recommendations for this particular deliverable. So, well, the deliverable that this conversation kind of leads to, which I actually don't have in front of me, but it is essentially the recommendations that the consortium is going to make for targets for reuse and recycling in oil and gas operations in the state, which then would have a corresponding decrease in the amount of freshwater use in oil and gas activities. And that's kind of the culmination of 2024 from a recommendation standpoint from the consortium. And then the legislation, HB 23-1242, also requires ECMC to have a rulemaking by the end of December 2024 on produced water. And so the scope of that rulemaking for ECMC is also defined in the legislation, and is essentially similar to the recommendations that we would be making. And so they'd be looking at targets for reuse and recycling in oil and gas activities in the state. Now, the way that the rulemaking process works with the state is there's a notice requirement for rulemaking. There's draft rules that have to be developed. There's a stakeholder process that needs to happen. There's a certain amount of time that needs to happen between the initial submission of the notice for rulemaking and the development of the draft rules and the hearing itself, the rulemaking itself, which would actually have party presentations and continuing modifications of the draft rules through feedback from different parties within the rulemaking to ultimately develop the rules. So that's a long way of saying it's at minimum a 3-month process from the development of draft rules to the rulemaking, and ECMC is required to have that rulemaking by the end of December of 2024. So what that means is that we need to provide relatively clear recommendations to ECMC by September. And so that enables ECMC to take those recommendations, build draft rules, and then develop those into the first step of that rulemaking process. And so that's why we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here slightly and starting to think about why, what does it look like to have ambitious goals around reduction of freshwater use and use of recycling and produced water now, so that we can start to build upon this over the next 3 months to be able to really have relatively clear, and we don't have to have a final product until December, but it doesn't make sense for us to have a final recommendation to ECMC after they did the rulemaking, right? So we want to have a pretty clear recommendation or focus towards ECMC by September. So that's the timeline. That's why we're doing this stuff now. And I just wanted to make sure it was clear for everyone. Any questions about that? Okay. So let's hear what folks came up with for their homework assignments. Appreciate everyone participating. Saw lots of email chatter about it, and really appreciate the folks that stepped up and helped organize and the participation in this. It sounded like they were good conversations. So on my list, first is group 1. And so, Jolie.
Have a microphone, please. Hi. Thank you. Thank you. Jolie Bronner, thank you very much. I will be reporting out some of the notes from group 1. That includes our Chairman Sarah, also Tricia, Jeff, Clay, Ember, Joe, Tracy, and myself. And so if anyone has comments or things to add from our conversation that you feel I don't capture, please add them so we have a more holistic view of how our conversation went. But really, I enjoyed our conversation very much. I thought it was a great way to start tackling this. We really started with the idea that reduction in water should start in areas with the biggest bang for the buck, with specific area considerations, and that's when we started to discuss this basin by basin approach that we've been talking about a lot today, so I won't dive into that in extreme detail, but we then started to discuss what does it actually look like to have 100% reduction in water use? What if there was 100% reduction in fresh water use? How much would that cost? What infrastructure would that take? What would that actually look like? And then where can we not do that? We had some discussions around protecting aquifers, things like that, and making sure we fully understand where that reduction can happen and where it can't, and then how we can have higher targets for that. But we did notice that it appears the vast majority of water use is in the DJ. Why is that? And there should be a primary area of focus, which we also discussed today. And we also got into some interesting conversations around the advantages and disadvantages of the carrot versus the stick. Subsidies came up, and so we then also talked about, well, if we're going to talk subsidies, we have to talk penalties too. We can't just talk about rewarding. What does it mean if we're not hitting these targets? Are there things on the other end to carrot and stick as we work with our motivations here? And then really focusing on making sure there's coordination with federal agencies and their regulatory requirements, of course, when we talk about these huge reductions, having those voices at the table. So again, we can fully understand that landscape. But we really talked about the need to understand where the state is going from a water perspective to better align our goals. Perhaps utilization of the state's water plan could be helpful in this, is what we decided as a group. And then we also wanted to emphasize minimizing ground disturbances and utilizing the existing infrastructure. I know that's going to come up a lot in our infrastructure discussions and more, and we already covered that today. And then include consideration for a formulaic approach in areas with water scarcity. We talked about this in the meeting. And then lastly, we also talked a little bit about what does this look like if we talk about a tiered approach, which we did talk about today at length. Like, what does 5 years look like? What does 10 years look like? What does different percentages in reduction look like? And really understanding that need to transition an industry instead of just switching overnight. That was kind of the overview of our conversation, but I'll hold in case anyone from our group has things to add or additional perspective.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for kicking us off. Next is group 2. Who wants to speak for group 2? And that's Barbara, Kevin, Jacob, Peter, Rick, Doug, and Zai. Okay, Zai.
Rick will talk for, I think, you know, Rick, do you want to talk to the group?
Rick?
Yeah, now's a convenient time to have technical difficulties. I don't think I can. I'm unprepared. I don't have any notes.
Yeah, what is the,
Maybe we can come back to group.
yeah.
We'll come back to group 2, good call. How about group 3, which is Tessa, Harmony, Michael, Nicolina, Irene, John, and Chloe.
Tessa Swanson, Energy Liaison for CDKG. So, group 3, for our goals and what we need to consider, we came up with a few kind of items on here. The first was, look, I'm not doing stream of consciousness or else we'll be here for the next 4 hours. Would be having to have numeric measurable targets. So we'd have to consider that, having a specific number or some number range in mind. As well as a comparison of recycled water used in drilling and completions operations versus produced water recycled overall. Just kind of a relative balance of which direction we want to look on that. So that ambitious goal would have to take that into account. Our ambitious goal is more of a short-term goal of saying, like, for example, reducing freshwater usage in oil and gas that's used by like 5 to 20% based on mix and other infrastructure and availability concerns. So let's get to the benefits and challenges. This is where most of our discussion really kind of got exciting. The benefit is, of course, a marginal increase in available freshwater for use elsewhere. That's kind of the primary, obvious, direct benefit. The challenges were where we like to focus the most because we were somewhat pessimistic. We like to be that way. And that was it. One of the biggest challenges here is the possibly increased truck traffic or right-of-way construction for the infrastructure associated with produced water. That means the biggest challenge associated with that is identifying the minimum infrastructure required to gain the maximum benefit related to produced water. So it's high grading for those engineers, since we talked about that. The exact where is the easiest place to achieve that with the lowest infrastructure concerns and costs? Where do we already have infrastructure? And identifying the hazards and hazards that could be safety, it could be pollution, it could be many things with storing, moving, and handling produced water. Most of us in this room, I think, and possibly listening in, are aware of all of the complexities that go along with pipelines in general. In the state of Colorado, produced water is no exception, and all of the fluids that go into pipelines, which includes produced water for that. Aligning the operator economic incentives, which in plain language means making it easy and clear for operators to be able to participate in this minimum effort, maximum benefit sort of relationship there. Most operators want to do this. Water is expensive for them to produce, it's expensive for them to recycle, it's expensive for them to dispose of. So any way that it could be cheaper, operators will agree down. I think all the operators are nodding their head right now in the room. So how do we align that with those targets? And lastly, for another challenge, is identifying those obstacles on kind of a case-by-case basis. The definition of a case is very unclear here for a reason. It could be field, it could be a particular operation, it could be a pad, it could be a basin, and recording that data so that we can continue to evolve that. So I think that's most of our time.
Great, thanks. Next up, group 4, which is John, Heil, Randy, Mark, Emma, Eric, Nikki, James, and Thomas.
Good afternoon, Brandy Honeycutt here, representing the group. We kind of started out by talking about what is the definition of fresh water anyway? You know, are we talking about water with 2,000 parts per million TDS or less, or 1,000 TDS or less? We talked a little bit about the characteristics of brackish water. We talked about, you know, is fresh water any type of water that's available to use, or are we also including non-traditional sources like domestic wastewater, like reclaimed water? So sort of talking about how to start with creating a goal by understanding, defining what we're working with, right? Another thing we talked about was, you know, knowing the volume of water being used now, which obviously we've been working on, to understand what a reasonable and ambitious goal would be for reductions. So we had our conversation was more about things that need to be in place to have an ambitious goal that would be successful. So we talked a lot about disproportionately impacted communities and just generally the public, and how, you know, public perception of perceived safety is going to be important to manage. When you talk about infrastructure like storage and transportation, you're looking at potential spills. You know, public concerns could be what are the impacts to drinking water. You need to be able to articulate how you're being protective of these things and protecting the public, and they need to understand it. So education and outreach is probably going to be a constant need. We also talked about sort of safety implementation in terms of water quality. You know, obviously treatment technologies, but how many monitoring points might be needed to be protective, you know, for different types of uses, and to protect the environment from spills and things like that, to understand the water quality of what's being reused. We also talked about honoring regulatory constraints, which is always something we've got to do. We talked a little bit about kind of maybe outside the box possibilities. Well, this isn't really outside the box, but the storage of treated produce water for reuse needs to be addressed to maximize reuse and reduction. So that seems like a really big thing we have to figure out. But we also talked about, you know, like the cost of technology for treatment and conservation techniques and how that comes into play. We talked about, you know, other parts of the business and how can freshwater reuse be reduced and reused there, like with dust suppression and things like that. And this was more of my outside the box stuff with partnerships. So I think it was Eric that brought up the Colorado Water Conservation Board Basin roundtables. Now those basins are always working on conservation practices and programs and implementation. And so how can we kind of partner with them and latch on to what they're doing and replicate some of their practices in the oil and gas industry? And then also talked a little bit about water sharing agreements and between operators and even other water users, which we've touched a lot on today. So, you know, if you've got another water user that's got a surplus year, you know, what kind of agreement could be put into place to maximize that surplus? So, you know, at the end of the day, I always think of water conservation as being efficient with what you have. And so I think that's kind of where we were going with a lot of this, but don't know if I missed anything.
Great, thanks, Brady. Barbara?
I want to comment on the suggestion that you learned from roundtables and trying to make that. Having been on a roundtable since 2006, I just want to comment, it is a group of stakeholders interested in water with very different perspectives. So you come together with the glue that keeps those groups together is funding through CWCB for projects. So if we're talking about doing something like that, and I think it's a great idea, basin by basin, the thing that makes that work is there's some money behind it that's an incentive to work on conservation. So thank you for that.
Zach, we'll come back to you.
I don't have microphone, I can tell. So we did probably a better job coordinating, but I can try to respond. I think our question was, I don't know if to say simple, but start discussion about the ambitious goal of freshwater reduction in oil and gas activities. I don't know if just reducing freshwater use is ambitious. I think ambitious is to eliminate freshwater use in oil and gas. And I think it is limited by the productivity of the field. If the field doesn't have enough water for operation, you have to source water from outside. And then I think it all relies on ability to reuse water and to treat existing water. If you do have the water, how to treat it and how, as a consequence, reduce use of other waters in the field. So, continue to discuss about this. I think it's not too complicated. Also, glad to see you.
Well, thanks everyone for sharing the thoughts from the discussions that you've all had. And starting to get our brain around this idea of, you know, what are the things that we need to be thinking about as we start to think about, you know, ultimately accomplishing our legislative requirement. And I did just pull it up so that I could remember exactly what it said. And it says, on or before December 1st, 2024, the consortium shall develop short and long-term produced water reuse and recycling goals and recommendations for the state and contemporaneous decreases in freshwater use. And so we're really looking at, you know, what are some short and long-term goals, and what are those targets that we're going to be setting. And we are setting targets basin by basin. What are some of the things we need to be thinking about? What is the infrastructure that's going to be necessary? What are some of the barriers in place that would enable higher levels of recycling? How do we address areas that already have significant amounts of recycling occurring right now? And are there considerations that need to happen in those basins? And so I'd like to just have kind of an open discussion right now. And just, again, to continue that thought process, but how should we approach this? The next step here in July is to provide direction to Hope and the rest of the staff on developing a draft concept here. And what does that need to look like? What is that direction from a short and long-term goal standpoint? What are the timelines? What are some percentage considerations? How do we tie all this stuff together? I want to just have a kind of open conversation about that for a while here. And just let people really get those thoughts out so that we're prepared to think about proposing specific things to Hope as far as the direction on July 1st, so that she and the rest of the staff can start working on developing those short and long-term goals. So, floor is open. Mike.
Thanks, John. Mike Freeman. I just had a question about the scope of what we should be considering. At the start of it, you mentioned that we have to make recommendations for ECMC through rulemaking in the year. But we're thinking about what our options are, what tools we ought to be considering. You can certainly imagine things that would require legislation as opposed to being rulemaking. Is legislation on the table, or should we keep our thinking focused purely on what ECMC?
I think it's a great question. So I think it's important for us to realize that this consortium doesn't end on January 1st, 2025, right? So just because we make recommendations and get 8 of the 9 deliverables accomplished, the work's not done, the kind of thought processes aren't done, and the recommendations that come from this body aren't done. So I think this is my opinion, so I mean, I'm not directing this to do anything. But I think that for the December 2024 ECMC rulemaking, as far as our recommendations go, I think it makes some sense for us to be relatively narrow in our recommendations as to short and long-term goals specifically. And also being able, in those recommendations, to be able to have the analytics behind it that say, this is why we think this is achievable, this is how we came up to these conclusions. And these are the reports that we're building on right now. But that doesn't limit us from making recommendations in the future on all things produced water to any state agency and or the legislature. And whether that's to barriers, whether that's legislation that could be contemplated that could help achieve the goals that we set. Because these goals that we set may not be achievable. So I'm making numbers up here, so don't quote me on any of this. I'm making numbers up. If we set a goal of 50% in some cases, that, and we need to accomplish that by 2030. There may need to be legislation that happens in order to enable certain things to happen to be able to accomplish that goal. But there may need to be rulemakings that need to happen in order for that goal to be accomplished. But all of that doesn't have to be done through the December rulemaking. That's my thought at least. So there's a brainstorm. So Zai?
So just to continue what you just said, I brought too much data to simulate. Do we have the data of how much entities in the different basins consume, what type of water they consume, and how much produced water they produce, to start closing the mass balance and saying, is it even possible to get rid of fresh water, or will have to depend on fresh water? If we have the data, I think it would be easy to start going forward and start developing how do we get rid of this addiction to fresh water. without data, it would be difficult.
I mean, that's a little before, is that data. So that's actually what is being produced right now, is that data around produced water volumes, freshwater volumes utilized, and how much produced water is being produced. So yes, the data is available. Yes, it's continuing to be compiled and refined. And I think that ends up being a really important part of the conversation for my opinion. So here.
So we
I have
do,
a quick question, that's online comment.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try. Okay, I'm gonna try to catch everyone, so you're gonna have to leave your hands up a little longer so that I can see what's happening here. So Clay, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I was just typing in the chat. Didn't know if you guys could see me. Yeah, one of the things I think would be well worth considering is to ask the oil and gas operating community. You got two great representatives on the panel as it is, but even expand that to maybe the top 10 most active operators in the DJ Basin, for instance, and ask them, how would you, what would be required for you to reduce your freshwater consumption in oil and gas activities by some targeted amount? But 10%, call it 20%, whatever, and ask them how could they do that? And how would they offset that by the use of produced water, to offset that freshwater reduction? And let them tell us how would they go about that? Is it possible? Yeah, at this moment in time, what would have to change in order for them to be able to do that? Because these are the folks, even though many of us are from the oil and gas operating community, and tangentially, it would be great to hear directly from them about what would they have to do to reduce their use of fresh water and increase their use of produced water, what logistical considerations would be required, and hear what they have to say as we look at, trying to evaluate what kinds of requests make sense for us to make.
Thanks, Clay. Tessa, I want to send.
Tessa Sorensen, I did not plan to, I didn't know what Clay was going to say, but this fits in perfectly with what he was talking about. We hear a lot about how, we've already heard many times over many sessions that one well or one pad isn't enough to create enough water to be recycled for one operation, things like that. What we do see is a couple of basins where we have a lot of operators near each other. I think if we're going to make a recommendation to a regulatory body to do a rulemaking, one of those recommendations might be to create a regulatory pathway for, I'm going to call it pooling of produced water or produced water fit for recycling to be somehow shared or used or conglomerated. I don't pretend to have the details or know whether it's possible, but we need to know if it's possible, because if it is, it's something we could highly recommend for something to be done in a regulatory fashion to enable that for increased recycling, because of the barriers of operators working with other operators because they're within their own limits. I have no idea who's next. I know.
I'm gonna go with Clorel, and then I'm gonna jump over here.
Cool, then, I start getting concerned when I hear words like incentivize or, you throw out 50% in the print. But if we start saying, this must happen, and we haven't identified, and I know this is the wrong use of the word externalities, so I'm not talking about economic externalities, I'm talking about potential impacts, adverse impacts from moving around produced water or storing it without considering sort of the larger effects of that. So, I just don't want to get ahead of our skis by saying, we really need produced water, or we really need fresh water. That would be a positive impact at what cost. So just really being aware of demanding things or regulating things or recommending things that could cause adverse effects.
I think it's a really good point. It's one that came up, I think, in every conversation I heard as far as homework goes. And it ends up being an important part of the conversations or contemplations that we have here, I think, is we do say, okay, everyone everyone in the DJ Basin has to recycle 35% of their water by 2027. You know, that may cause pretty significant environmental impacts, public health impacts. So good point. All right.
Carmen Woolley. So a couple things that I've heard today. I've heard completely do away with freshwater use. I've also heard reduce freshwater use. And one of the primary things we've been talking about is health and safety. I want to inform all of you that really fresh water, based on my experience, my conversations with operators, with engineers, petroleum engineers, is that fresh water is needed to ensure the integrity of the well, to protect groundwater resources, to ensure that there's not air emissions. So we don't want to do away with freshwater use. We still need to allow that, but we can reduce its use and increase recycling of produced water. As far as produced water is concerned, like some folks have said, usually it requires multiple wells, right, that are producing water. Not all formations produce water. Some formations are incredibly dry, right? It's just not going to be feasible. And so when we're thinking about this, zooming out, I think we should be identifying where oil and gas development is primarily occurring. It's not necessarily going to be where infrastructure exists. Usually when you're going forward, when you're developing wells, you're expanding out. Just like communities, right? Those leases are being developed, little by little. And so you'll see those wells, move with the leases. And so I would say, really strategically think, where you have multiple operators, where there's existing leases, where that development is likely to occur. And then when it comes to the basins, right, Piceance Basin already has a lot of existing infrastructure. They're already recycling, reusing produced water. So a lot of the infrastructure that's there, I guess the means for them to be doing that can be an example for others to follow. Other basins have existing infrastructure. It would be good to know if that is outdated, if there's health and safety concerns using that infrastructure, and whether or not there is proposed development in those basins. And then the DJ Basin, I think, tends to be a major focus here. It has the least infrastructure, but it has the most proposals. So it seems to me like we're probably focusing on the DJ Basin. And then another thing that I wanted to really promote is that when it comes to, I guess, just water use in general, right, it involves conversations with communities. And usually those conversations involve benefits to those communities. So it's not just freshwater use or recycling of it. It's, hey, is there infrastructure that's out there? Are there lines that could be replaced, that could be co-located with this? And that's been successful in a lot of these communities that have oil and gas development. They can use funding. They can, utilize those opportunities to benefit.
Eric?
Yes, thank you, Eric England. In relation to the goal, I think it will be helpful for me, and I think the other operators as well, is as we define what that goal is, it's understanding, is it a recycle based upon a benchmark? Is it a recycle on a well by well level, a pad by pad level, an annual water use consideration? As we frame up this target goal, it will really influence the solutions that we choose to work with, whether it's working with other operators, going at it alone, building new infrastructure, sharing infrastructure. It's understanding the framework for what that goal will be. So that will be helpful for our consideration as we make a recommendation, is the detail of the goal.
Well, let me also throw that back to you as you're starting to think about this. I think it's important for us to hear from operators, what is that appropriate metric? Is it per location, a per well, annual water use? What makes the most sense, as we start to consider a metric for accomplishing this deliverable? I'm not saying you have to have it right now, I'm just saying that it would be good to hear.
Sure, and not with a full complete answer, but just some understanding. There could be some locations that it's harder to complete a successful recycle or a freshwater reduction because of not only the operational impacts, but the community impacts. There could be other areas where we're extremely successful, and on aggregate, we're able to achieve our goals. So try to understand how we can meet the expectation and do it most effectively with those least impacts.
That was a great consideration. Rick?
Thank you, Commissioner. I had a thought while we were talking here, and I haven't really heard us discuss it in here before, and maybe you have previously before I joined the consortium. But one thing we do not talk about is an impediment to, granted a term length impediment to eliminating freshwater use is, and this is probably a very selective group, there are companies that have built 10, 20, 30-mile pipelines from local reservoirs to bring fresh water into where the oil and gas activity is ongoing and future plans are for it. Those pipelines were built based on term contracts with operators that they agreed to buy a minimum amount of fresh water per year for the length of that term in order to justify building that pipeline and recovering the cost of that pipeline. Those are legally binding contracts. We can't just go, okay, they're eliminated. And so that means at least for the length of that contract, those operators are going to have to buy a certain amount of fresh water coming out of those pipelines.
Actually, good consideration. I haven't thought of that at all. Harmony?
Harmony Cummings. I had a couple follow-up things I wanted to say to some people and some folks. One of them, though, a definition of water is not in the bill because it already exists somewhere in state statute. So just finding exactly what that is. As far as truck traffic, that was definitely one of the most disappointing things working on this legislation for the coalition that we were in. It's just how little information is being tracked and how easily that could be tracked. And even people inside right now tell me, Harvey, we have to give that information, a lot of that to the counties when we're doing the traffic in and out sort of thing. So that information is already available by the companies. They could easily share that with the ECMC to be calculating emissions for that. The other one thing I want to add is I met with a company out of Montana who is doing imaging of methane, flyover imaging. And I asked, where is the most emissions coming from? And they said compression stations and tanks. And then I said, what about like the trucks and the produced water? And they're like, it's kind of hard for us to see what's going on from this level. But what we do see is when the trucks are coming in and out, there's a lot of trucks. And it's not just off the engine that we're seeing the emissions, we're off of the bed of the truck as well. And then I think, oh, the bed is just a moving tank. So as we're moving this, trucks become a moving pipeline through these communities. And having worked in several communities on indigenous lands in North Dakota, Northern Colorado, the poison sugar fields of Louisiana, and East Texas, my heart is pounding right now. Because we are moving pipelines of produced water through these communities that are having these evaporations come off. And these are the communities that are already suffering the most from cumulative impacts. And then I just think about that water and I think about the workers who are handling it. I think about where that's going in our ground. And then I think about the ECMC inspectors I've had conversations with who've told me, Harmony, when we go out and we inspect these areas where there have been the wells from the 80s, they're all like leaking. And what about the ones we're building today? How do we know they last in 20, 30 years? Can you guarantee that? I'm rambling a little. Let me get back to my list. The original legislation for this bill had 90% reuse. Know that that was the starting point. Know that that number could not be used because we're not collecting really any data on water usage, which is mind-blowing. Is anyone else disappointed and shocked that we haven't been collecting data? This is our most precious resource and it is life. This week, I attended an EPA meeting on water equity around the South Platte River. And we talked about why does one user get to use the water to the point of extinction? And especially in a time when Denver Water is having to spend millions and millions of billions of dollars to build new reservoirs and dams. When people are having to build municipal pipelines, there's county commissioners here to get water for people. And I say that in the context of all these conversations. And because I have really appreciated so much of what you've had to say. But the thing that was really jumped out was when we said we need fresh water because of the integrity of the concrete in the well, and that makes perfect sense to me. That said, but we don't want to use produced water because we have concerns about it there. But we want to put it on crops, use it in firefighting and dust suppression and irrigation. I have my brain doesn't process how both those things exist. And since this is a roundtable, I'm glad I had the opportunity to say some of these things because sometimes it feels like it's hard to have conversations in these spaces.
All right.
Less impassioned comment. Thank you, Romy. Yes. So I want to go back to the map that we saw that has the pie charts showing the amount of produced water and the amount of water used for well completion. And when we look at where the best balance is, the amount of water produced versus the amount of water used, and this data is from 2022, which I hadn't noticed before. Be interesting to see the 2023 data. I'm going to point you to my home basin, Jackson County, and the North Platte, the North Park Basin. You'll notice that it's almost an even pie chart. And when I hear all of you talking about the complexity of multiple operators and cooperative agreements and the difficulty that might present, there's only one shale oil operator, and it's copious quantities of gas as well as shale oil. But almost an equal amount of produced water and water used for completion. So I'm just throwing that out here. It'd be interesting if we could pick a basin to do a pilot project on recycling and reuse, and we might want to think about a basin that has no existing infrastructure for that, but has a good balance in water produced versus water used. Whether Fulcrum Energy would be interested in coming to the table to do that, I can't speak for them. But I'm just throwing that out there as an idea for a pilot project.
Amber.
Amber Michael, I have 3 items for discussion, which actually, Barbara, your comment was a good segue to this one, was a tiered roadmap approach for ECMC recommendation and short-term, long-term, and trying to understand the uniqueness of all the basins. And so perhaps we could, if you were saying, do a pilot program or show our first year focus for legislation on, say, the DJ, and then we can start going into the Piedmont, Storytelling, San Juan Basin. I'm not sure that we have all the data and analytics at this moment to be able to fully assess the state. So trying to segment it perhaps and take a real strong analytical approach to each basin as opposed to trying to do, for lack of a better word, blanket regulatory approach. My second thought that I'd like to propose for consideration is just the legal impacts of water rights, tributary, non-tributary waters, and just before we start asking operators and others to start moving water and shifting it and sharing it and these types of things, I think we really need to understand the legalities of that. We could put ourselves as a state or as a tribe as operators into some situations there. We break against the water rights. And then my final thought was on permitting timelines. And this could go from construction, this could go from right-of-ways. Do we, as a consortium, and I know the legislature and the ECMC, they understand timelines and some other agencies, but I don't want to put undue or unattainable timelines on our operators because of some of the regulatory constraints that are already in place. And so I think it's really imperative that we look at that and make sure that we're setting everybody up for success to be able to, if we're saying let's do this by this time frame, is it possible? Because permitting can take anywhere from 3 months to 2 years, depending on the project and if it's fee land or federal lands. And so it's all different, and I think that we should take that position.
Thanks. I'm trying to catch everyone in order, but I know I'm not doing it right. So you got a microphone, so I'm going to.
I just have two.
Yeah, really question. I'll go
And
next.
it echoes, sorry, this is cool, it echoes a couple things that Harmony brought up, which is freshwater defined in all of this, or is it just referenced outside? Do we have like a working definition of what freshwater is? Do we have multiple definitions? Okay, in the first part, sorry.
I just pulled it up, it's not in the draft.
Okay.
It's not in the legislation itself.
No, yeah, give us a second. We'll
The second question I have is, are we considering cumulative impact assessments within our communities, these pilot projects? I mean, impact assessment being benefits and negative impacts.
Say the first part of your question. I was working on the water.
The basics of it. Are we considering cumulative impact assessments within whatever recommendations?
So I'm not sure actually. I think maybe we talked about this a couple of meetings ago.
Yeah.
Maybe I haven't talked about it. So ECMC is required to do cumulative impacts rulemaking, and that rulemaking, the scope of that rulemaking is still it's become more defined after some legislation in 2024. Certainly water could be contemplated as a necessary part of the cumulative impacts analysis. Before the 2024 legislative session, when we were beginning the process of the cumulative impacts rulemaking in 2000, it was still in 2024, but it was before the end of the legislative session. There was some discussion about asking the consortium to make some recommendations around cumulative impacts around water. And so I think ECMC is still interested in having the consortium have conversations about cumulative impacts associated with water, making recommendations to ECMC around that. But I don't know if it has to be part of the December timeline. Does that make sense? So I think I actually would appreciate the consortium being willing to do that should the consortium decide to do that. But I think it would be in 2025.
Thank you. I was going to go next. Just adding to, I think it was a combination of both of your comments covered. I want for a case study or a pilot project, and then also this is Jolie Bronner, by the way, I'm so sorry about that. As we talk about any transitioning industry, I want us to just make sure we're really thinking about suggestions or urging legislation that has this tiered effect that we talked about and is basin specific, but I think there should be benchmarks and goals that range in like percentages that we can then say, like reduced by this with this much time, reduced by this with this much time, reduced by this, and it can be different per basin. But what I want to also urge us to do, and we do this in some other areas, an example, I work with ag producers a lot. They love to work with other ag producers to create communities of practice and share knowledge and talk about the best way to do things that they learned in the field. And so this idea, as we start to talk about maybe there's a way to pool resources, maybe knowledge can be one of those resources too. And so as we talk more, there are some producers that are doing better or worse jobs depending on what your metrics are for that. And so maybe there's a way that we can even identify people that are leaders in this space, trailblazers, doing amazing things with produced water, and create communities of practice where we can pool that water, and we can treat that water, and we can use existing infrastructure, but also support folks without it. So just wanted to add those to our recommendations. Thanks.
Trish?
Yeah, thanks. Trish Pfeiffer, EPA. I do like the idea of the pilot project in one of the basins. And then I also liked Rick's, I think it was Rick or maybe it was Clay that mentioned polling the major operators in the various basins so we can understand what is feasible, because there does have to be an economic component to what we're talking about. For the recommendations that you're looking for, I think identifying the data gaps that we are running into as we move through the various deliverables would be helpful. And then I just had a specific question about the DJ Basin because it seems to be an area of most interest. Is the roadblock for the pipelines, is it a physical roadblock that it just because it looked like on the map that you had chunks of pipelines in different areas, but they weren't connected? And is that the hindrance, or is there a potential regulatory roadblock there also for producers to be able to share produced water?
I don't know that I can answer that real time.
So
Yeah.
I have spoken to some people in the DJ Basin, and I think it's more of a physical roadblock, because you have to cross roads and railroads and people's property, and some people don't want to get access. So I think as far as regulatory or physical, it leans more towards physical. So going along those lines, so the oil and gas operators, there are larger and smaller operators with leases that they're trying to develop, and they have different capabilities and resources. So I think having a pilot project sounds great, and then reaching out to probably those larger operators with more resources and capabilities is also probably a good call. And then when it comes to data, just backing it up, I feel like I came late to the party. But I've seen a lot of information today, and it seems like there are data gaps, just with the baseline data that we can work with. So, do we have a good understanding of how much produced water, or how much water is being produced from oil and gas development? Do we have a good understanding of what the freshwater use is, of what the recycled water use is, and what it's used for? And then one thing I do also want to clarify is that when it comes to recycled water, at least when it comes to federal wells and development, I've only seen water recycled for oil and gas use. So I haven't seen it for other uses like residential or fire or wildlife. I have heard of produced water from CDM wells being used for, I think, wildlife or grazing, but that water has been tested, sampled for its quality, so it meets certain standards. So I just want to clarify which is why I said earlier that I'm a proponent of narrowing the scopes, that we're focusing on maybe industrial and commercial uses, but allowing the flexibility for it to expand in the future into other uses if it's deemed feasible.
Rick?
Thank you. Hey, I wanted to expand on the discussion about the difficulty in putting in pipelines. Nowadays, depending on the diameter of the pipeline, it's quite popular for us to use underground boring to install the pipeline. That way it's less surface disturbance and stuff like that. And you can get permitted. It depends on the size of the highway, but you start talking about boring underneath a major state highway, that takes time to get permitted. And you mentioned railroads. I know for a fact, not in Colorado, but in another state, it took almost a year and a half to get the railroad to sign off on allowing us to bore underneath a railway to install a pipeline.
That's because the Oil and Gas Commission there is called the Texas Railroad.
Sorry, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I'm also a proponent of this idea of a pilot project. So asking the ECMC, so you know who's permitting right now, and maybe we can get an area that is new, because it's always harder to retrofit than to do it right at the first time. So if we take an area where we know they're about to start drilling, it's a large enough area that we can really implement the ideas that we're all coming up with, and have that be like a test case where we can learn from it.
Okay, I mean, it's a good idea. It's a good idea. I'm not sure how that accomplishes the short and long-term goals, but I'm not poo-pooing any ideas. Don't get me wrong.
Well, give us a test case of how to get to the ideal. So if we have the ability to build what we would like to see fresh, the ideal, then we would at least have a working model. No.
Anyway, I appreciate the thought for sure.
McLean and Pollock, I know you're gonna get irritated, but the pilot project, but I wanna advocate that each basin has a pilot project. I know that there's an emphasis on the DJ. But for example, the San Juan Basin is already using operator agreements from one another to utilize produced water for, drilling completions. So that could already be a pilot project that could be used before September. And I don't want to always utilize just the major operators. I think that the smaller operators have a lot to say, especially when it talks about economics and their appetite for things like that. So I wouldn't just reach out to, but to the smaller operators as well. Because what you'll find in the San Juan Basin, right, in the Raton, are much smaller operators.
Those are good points. And listen, I'm not poo-pooing the pilot project at all. I actually think it's a great idea. I make my head explode a little bit trying to figure out how we can do that in the short time we have. However, this consortium is going to be around for a long time, with lots of opportunity for research and pilot projects and implementation of some of these strategies. And so I think these are good ideas. For example, Barbara, the North Fork part, not only do they have no produced water infrastructure, but they also don't have any gas gathering infrastructure. So is there an opportunity to co-locate these labs, right? So anyway. Who's next? Go ahead.
So just thinking about that, I think that is great to focus on the different basins and have like a deliverable for each basin. Some, like you were just saying, the San Juan Basin, right, already has things in place, the Pinellas has things in place, where there could be just different deliverables, right? Because it just depends on each basin, what's already in place, and that could inform steps, moving forward in the progress. I also like to hear the idea that smaller operators, right, include them. So that's great to hear. Like I said, my focus has primarily been in the Pinellas Basin, where when I work with smaller operators, they have good intentions, but they just don't have the capabilities. So that's great to hear that that others are more resourceful and move forward. So as far as short-term and long-term is concerned, we're talking about the deliverables, right, what we're capable of doing, but going back to the baseline data, do we have the baseline data? I think short term, that would be great to go back out and make sure we have the data necessary to really inform the steps moving forward, but we could still make progress on you know, these pilot projects or deliverables in each basin.
Also, good time. I left extra time at the end here because I thought this particular discussion was going to be very robust and folks would have a lot of thoughts. And I also understand this is a messy session. I've not put any structure on it. I did that on purpose, again, to like have a really open train of thought kind of process that builds upon our homework so that we can get to a more structured conversation in the July meeting where we, where we are providing specific direction to open staff. So.
Okay. And forgive me, this is me just throwing stuff at the wall. Can we recommend the design of a pilot project? Think about things that we need to be able to make recommendations. I mean, this is my, here's my soapbox, we need more science, more data. How do we get that? And is that putting the horse in the cart in the correct order?
Very good thoughts. If you're asking me, I think the answer is yes. We can design the concept of a pilot project, and we can work with operators, and we can propose these things. And I think one of the other things to keep in the back of your minds as you're starting to think about the structure of this is, while we may make recommendations for short and long-term goals, the legislation says short and long-term goals for the reduction of water use. It doesn't say that it has to be a percentage reduction. It doesn't say that it has to. While I said percentages, that doesn't mean that that's what the legislation says. So when you do talk about pilot projects, that could potentially reduce, it's a goal to create a pilot project to reduce freshwater use, increase the amount of use, recycling. I think it certainly can be interpreted as meeting requirements of statute as we things. Now, how ECMC would potentially do a rulemaking that would incorporate that, or how to think about that a little bit, I'm not exactly sure. It's not a regulatory ask, right? Go ahead.
Tessa Sorensen, to quote Chair Messner from his hearings, I guess what I'm struggling with is, every hearing, John. I love it, we love it. Okay, so we have to provide some ECMC advice, which means we need to provide something to have a decision in there and guidance in there and have these staff for CPWC ready to write something in August, right? So time is so short. And I'm struggling to come up with what the specific ideas for what the additional framework. It doesn't have to be a massive rule, right? It doesn't have to be huge and game changing. It just has to be a step, because it doesn't have to be the only one either. But what are the actual achievable things on here? I love the pilot project discussion. It's not going to happen before just practically. That takes a minimum amount of time, and that's not 60 days at this point. So trying to figure out what are the specific framework guidance we can provide to staff to explore on what they can write. Because I don't know about you, the rest of you, but I've been really impressed by the hundreds of pages we produced at the consortium, because I didn't write much of it. I didn't write hardly any of it, right? But it's a tremendous amount of work. I know the staff can do a tremendous amount of work, as we've seen it, so you've kind of done your own grades. CBWC staff, now we know what you can do. But having those specific ideas on where we can go. I've had one, I hope, good idea, but I'd like to distill more from our members, something we can walk away with for that. You want to go next? I'm not sure.
Go ahead, Marcia.
If I'm not Barbara Vasquez, and we have someone online who also has his hand up. The simpler the better, to lead, to follow the lead that Tessa just gave us. When I talked about a pilot project, obviously you have to have the cooperation and investment from the operator or operators in the basin. That's a heavy lift, right? If the state isn't willing to pay to get the pilot project done. So that's a big step. But if we came up with rulemaking in ECMC that was very simply, each operator must reduce their freshwater use by X% by such and such a date, you at least have a starting point to go from. And I don't know what industry reps on the around the table feel about that. But when you talk about a percentage reduction, you're not talking about you must achieve a 50% reuse, right? You're talking about a percentage reduction from today's use. And that can be statewide and not basin specific.
Nikki
Wills. Just really quick, I hear a lot about how much we have to delegate and decide in a short amount of time. I'm thinking, because Chair is like, this is a continuance, like this is a long road ahead. We need to come up with strategic plan so in the future we don't have to backstep on things. I know we have to like rush things and be like, we need to make decisions, but we also need to make the right decisions that are going to affect everybody. I like the plan of a pilot too, but because I'm sitting in a community seat, I want to see something that benefits from disproportionate in neighborhoods and commute, like the animals, the water, all of that. I don't want to leave just communities, but for everybody, our parks, our recs, we just have to think about everybody and not. I like how the oil and gas, they like stick together and they're like, no, don't, they protect each other. Protect us too. Thank you.
Brandy, then Amber, then Mike. How's that?
Thank you, Chair Musser. Brandy Honeycutt with Water Quality. One other perspective we maybe have already kind of been thinking about, but maybe didn't state obviously is rather than looking at reduction goals, we can look at maximizing efficiency. And some of essentially that's a way to reduce freshwater use. We could be looking at things like techniques to reduce, like instead of a percent reduction at the pad site, it's implement XYZ measures that are more water efficient by a number of years and things like that. So like instead of looking at like reduce your water use, it can also be like look at innovation and have more like innovation goals in mind instead or as well.
Amber?
I think that's a really good idea. I like that. So, Chair, this is for a question for you. And essentially, I don't know if you can answer this, but when it comes to rulemaking from the ECMC, would they support basin-specific regulations, or does it need to be more overarching for the entire state? Just curious, because when all of our minds are going and we're all talking about the differences, has that been done before where they can go specific, or does it still need to be overarching?
That's actually a good question, and I'll probably lean on Kyle a little bit, but certainly there's specific area orders, like certain elements in our rules that have different rules for different parts of the state, well, only one part of it. But, and so I don't think it's impossible, but I think it would require the development of pretty specific boundaries and pretty specific guidelines of how are you making that determination and what's included in that. I mean, that's my initial thought on that, rather than on the kind of, so I don't know whether that's doable or not. I mean, I'm a commissioner, so I say do whatever I want.
Assistant Attorney General Kyle Davenport. Since the commissioner is sitting next to me, we can do whatever we want. No, I think that the question of, which I think, John, you got to, the question of how we do it is different from can you do it, and answering the question of can it be done. I'm not aware of any statute or anything that says, Commission, you may only promulgate rules that apply statewide. You can't be any more specific than statewide. So the answer, I think, is can ECMC adopt regulations that are basin specific? Is yes.
The legislation specifically says it means, sorry to interrupt, but required for each oil and gas production basin an accurate and consistent increase in use of recyclable.
Sorry about that, Harmony Cummings. Just specifically from the legislation, because this is something we spent a lot of time on, and so this is really interesting to me. But it references basins a number of times, and it says required for each oil and gas production basin an iterative and consistent increase in the use of recycled or reused produced water without increasing emissions associated with oil and gas operations. And so I think it definitely specifically says that we have to, and am I understanding your question correctly?
Yeah, I think Kyle was probably getting that from the Attorney General perspective. Just on if you can, I don't know if you can continue what you were saying.
Well, go ahead, finish. They can, but how?
Yeah, that's all I was going to say. I think the answer to can is yes. The commission, the ECMC could probably, it's hard sometimes to see in hypotheticals, but adopt a rule that applies only to a specific basin. As John just noted, the how is where it gets really complicated. How do you define what the boundaries are and come to those rules is a much more complicated question to answer.
Thank you so much, Emma from Adams County. I really appreciate this conversation, and that was one of the things that, well, I think we've all discussed the necessity for taking into account different geological formations and water present in the different basins. The ask is for us to have statewide regulations. And so I'm just kind of curious, as you read those requirements, can we have different triggers that are a single regulation, but when this amount of water is present, or when this type of geological formation is present, then this applies? And so that if water changes over the next 20, 30 years, would that allow us to get at regulating for conditions without saying, this is for DJ Basin, or, this is for this basin or that basin? Does my question make sense? Should I try to narrow?
Assistant Attorney General Kyle Davenport again. I think the short answer is yes. Rules could be written in a wide variety of ways. ECMC could work rules that would have triggers like what you're talking about. I don't believe the fact that ECMC has the authority to promulgate rules that apply statewide also is a limitation that requires ECMC only promulgate rules that apply to the entire state.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to make sure I understand that, at least from my understanding, I don't know if anyone else is getting anything like this. So the state authority of ECMC is statewide, and so you have to regulate on a statewide basis. And so to name jurisdictions or basins would violate your structure as ECMC. But if we were to articulate, because that's what I heard you say, if we were to articulate geological formations or water presence or other factors, we could create something that meets our needs. And I'd like to hear from the attorney.
I can speak from another agency that does this. But yeah, you have existing rules that apply in parts of the state already.
Tessa Swanson, CDPHE. Our air division has authority statewide, but has specific rules for the ozone non-attainment.
But that's triggered by Arizona non-attainment, it's not by geographic.
But that is a geographic definition.
I'm gonna let Kyle answer the question.
Kyle Davenport again. So I think Tess just gave a good example in the sense that that is an agency that has like ECMC statewide regulatory authority that has adopted rules that only apply in a specific area. And ECMC has those rules as well already. We have rules that only apply when in specific areas is laid out by the rules. Rules that apply only within a certain distance from an oil and gas location or something like that, they apply statewide in the sense they apply to any location like that. But the requirements only apply in specific circumstances. So hopefully I'm being clear enough that yes, ECMC can regulate oil and gas development in Colorado, but it can also adopt rules that would only apply in a specific area based on the circumstances or characteristics of a specific area.
And just to give a couple of examples of that, I mean, it's, I think that the area that we put specific regulations on is a defined area, right? So as you were saying, that's a non-attainment area is a defined area. A disproportionately impacted community is a defined term with a defined area. A high priority habitat is a defined area, a mapped area that has specific geographic boundaries. And so I think the answer is yes, it is possible. Your question, trying to figure out what those geographic boundaries are and what criteria you're utilizing to determine that basin. And again, we're a recommending body, right? So we're going to recommend things to the ECMC, and but there are more than 4 basins in Colorado, and so they're just going to divide the state forests. It's not our recommendation. I'm looking at bringing North Park into the Peons Basin. I'm making things up right now, but I mean these are the things that we need to be thinking about. So I really appreciate you bringing it up. To your point, I think that these ideas of triggers and quality of our geology and stuff like that are really ideas as well. Oh yeah, Clay. I'm sorry, I always forget online, so I apologize for saying that.
Please try and
Mute myself. There it is. There it is. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Commissioner. My comment was related to the idea of pilot program, and in light of the fact that we have both short-term and long-term horizons with regard to recommendations, and we all recognize the individual uniqueness of different basins and the amount of water, fresh water that's being used in those different basins, and the amount of produced water that may be being used in those basins today. I think it may be self-evident to say something like this, but I think it's probably worth at least noting, and that is that we could as a group, it seems evident to me that we could embrace the idea of requiring a pilot program in each basin for the, including the various objectives that that basin may need to address in order to meet some of, the principal deliverables of the legislation at some reasonable reduction level of of fresh water. That'd be an arbitrary number, but I'd propose like 25% and give them a reasonable time frame and then say, we're going to use these pilot programs that we're going to design in each specific basin to inform longer term recommendations. Now, like I say, that may be self-evident to everyone in regard to the use of a pilot program, but I think it's worth putting on the record there that we use a short-term pilot program to inform long-term recommendations in a basin-specific setting. That's all. Thanks.
Mike, thanks, Mike Freeman. I would like to kind of keep us over, bring us back to the question of what kind of recommendations we can make for rulemaking that would be feasible to get done by the end of the year. And I think when we think about that, we should give some thought to what information, what kind of factual development we would need in order to give the ECMC some meaningful recommendations that they can actually act on. And frankly, I think the work that we've done so far makes me really like Barbara's idea of setting a target for operators and recommend that the commission set a target. It could be basin by basin, it could be state, whatever, however you want to frame it, and say, here's the targets that we should at least think about working in that direction. Setting a target for each basin, give the ECMC what we've been able to develop in terms of a factual record for what we think could happen. I think certainly surveying operators for whether they can meet a certain target and how they meet it would be really important, but I think that's something we can do in the time we have allotted. And just one point, I mean, the commission rules, I believe, already require operators with their OGDPs to do a water management plan. When that rule was adopted, some of us were actually advocating to set targets then, but the commission felt we didn't have fact basis to really set that. I think now we have to make sure we actually have a fact record that would support real targets and let operators meet them, and recommend that the commission make operators meet them. I'm a little reluctant to reject a pilot project step in front of that for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, I really want to know exactly what information we expect to get out of a given pilot project and how that would lead to a broader rulemaking or a broader regulation. Just what I hear, we may need it, there's really good important data we got from that. But I've also heard throughout our meetings, these are all very site-specific requirement things. And a whole variety of factors, and I worry that if we say, if we start with the pilot project before we set any broad targets, then we'll be in a situation where the pilot project might be a one-off that is interesting, but I'm not sure how much information would get us for future rulemaking that we could actually use for broad rulemaking. I'm not saying it's not doable, but I want to answer those questions first. But ultimately, I think, given our time frame and the work this consortium has done, I would like to see us work towards recommendations on particular targets that we can recommend that ECMC adopt by regulation.
Michael, I want to clarify, my recommendation on the pilot project was not to precede our recommendations to ECMC. There's a time for that, but to follow, right? To gain more information about the how.
Harvey and Eric and Irene.
I'm impressed with the Irene. Molly, Armenia, thank you so much for referring to the bill. To know that we're focused on oil and gas development basins, that we're sticking with that intent. Speaking from federal perspective, when we are looking at water use, whether that be fresh water or produced water, it is by basin, by water basin. So when it comes to water rights, that's tied to it. But then you put on your cumulative impact analysis area hat, right? And so we are in the cumulative effects scenario of, okay, so what are we going to consider? We're considering water. We're considering traffic, right? We are considering emissions. Emissions, when we're talking about pits, you might be looking at emissions from those pits. It depends on the quality of your water. You're looking at wildlife, right? We are working on a big game plan right now and trying to minimize those impacts by piping that produced water from locations to a centralized facility. We are minimizing impacts to those big game. So just really big picture. Somebody or a few people actually touched on cumulative earlier, but I wanted to expand on it.
Thank you. Eric England again, and Harmony, I appreciate you mentioning the legislation, because one of my comments before was this baseline question: how do we measure and know that we're achieving our goal? The language does reference the increase in usage of recycled and reused water and decreasing the amount of fresh water. Again, though, helping me, I guess, is what I'm asking to frame up what is the measurement basis that we know we've achieved that, and asking in regard to, I think Barbara, just as an example, said if 23 is the baseline, if an operator had 2 wells last year that they developed, and then this year they have 4 wells that they're developing just because of permitting timing, if they're held to last year's standard, can they meet the objective with a different development plan this year if we're looking at just total water usage? So again, trying to help us think through, or you help me understand when we set that target goal, is it a percentage based upon the type of activity? Is it a cap based upon a particular historic usage? Because that will so critically drive the type of solutions that we need to bring to the table, is understanding the magnitude and the measurement of that recycle target.
I have some over here. Irene, sorry. And then we'll go over to, I think, particularly now, Harmony and Barbara.
Irene Anders, so I'm curious, is there an established best practices of water management in oil and gas development? And if not, can we establish one, and is there a place where this could be posted so people know that we can see who has been most successful, figure out what are the practices that they implement? Could be something like when you're permitting for your gas line at the same time, get the permit for produced water and lay your infrastructure at that point in the project, or things like that. Are there any best practices that have been established?
One. It was deliverable 1. We did a literature review for best practices for water management. And so I think that certainly could be added on. I think it's a living document, but I think that was the goal with deliverable 1, was to provide those best management practices.
And are they being distributed to producers? And how do they know that these are best practices? I'm talking about business practices that, just how to financially be more successful in using a minimal amount of water to have a more successful operation. What companies have done.
I don't have the answer to that.
Well, it could be something that we could, have available to producers.
Okay.
I think your comment will be addressed when we do some targeted outreach, and that's in our strategic plan.
So I had to leave next Barbara, then I had hardly heard that she's not here, so no one would.
I kind of want to second and pat Eric on the back. That's kind of what all of us in industry are saying. And I'm curious, what happens if we don't meet the target? You can't really set a goal, right, unless you kind of know what the consequence is, or good or bad consequence, right? I just want to know what's going to happen if we don't meet the target.
Well, I mean, some of these questions that you're asking are going to come out of the rulemaking, right? So we're a recommending body, we're not making a determination about what the consequences are. But I think as industry reps, my hope would be that you're helping develop these rather than reacting to them. So I would be curious to hear from you as far as, you know, again, how to develop those metrics. Is it per well, is it per operator, is it per location? Is it based on geology and volume of water, like Emma has mentioned? You know, what are the best ways to develop that metric? You know, and I think it'd be great to hear like what you think is achievable, so that we can add 15 to 20%.
I just feel like we keep saying what we think the metrics is, you know, and
I think a lot of us who are in industry or expertise have said it, right? And we don't ever want to put like an exact number, right? Because each basin or each well or, you know, each facility might be different. I just think we keep saying it, and we just keep recommending what we think the standard might be or the matrix might be, and I think it gets lost. So that's why I'm like, well, then what if you don't meet the target?
Sure.
So
these are all going to be, again, this is the messy part, right? So we're not coming to conclusions, we haven't like made any decisions on any of this. We're just trying to get it all out so that we can have more structured conversation in the near future. And so, you know, if you want to have a conversation about and want to have it as part of the deliverable, you know, the hammer versus the carrot, then I think that we can have that conversation. Barbara,
I really want to thank you for asking that more specific question, because I realized how incomplete my recommendation for the 10% reduction was, because it's going to vary for those wells that have horizontal drilling, for the length of the horizontal, et cetera, the number of wells complete in a given year. So I think it probably has to get more specific, where there are trigger points for the length of your lateral, et cetera. And I'm sure that would be worked out as the rulemaking sausage is made.
Thank you, Chair. I think that I'm kind of going along with what you guys are saying in establishing a baseline. Like, I think if we can make recommendations for the rulemaking, say like, you know, a certain number of operators, sites, or X number in certain basins need to implement these innovative technologies or these practices, we are then going to monitor their water usage from before and after kind of thing, and incorporate things like if they added new wells or whatever other circumstances might change, and really look at what the difference is between before and after, and then we can set goals based on that. So it is kind of like a pilot project where we're doing it in real time with real operators, collecting data, and then moving on from there.
Yes, one online.
so we'll be ready?
Yeah. Just with regards to best practices, there's no all-encompassing document out there that everybody says this is what everybody must follow. But there are best practices available. The American Petroleum Institute has numerous best practices documents. However, I'm not sure all operators have access to those, because especially smaller independents generally aren't a member of API. The American Exploration and Production Council may have a set of best practices, and they tend to have a lot of the smaller operators reporting to them, as well as there are statewide oil and gas industries that are more focused on the state that have some best practice documents. And I'd also mention that a good best practice reference material is the Groundwater Protection Council report that was issued in 2019, which was a 300+ page white paper on produced water.
Thanks, Rick.
Carmia Woolley. So at this point in time, I don't feel like I personally have enough data to really commit to something other than pilot projects. And I say that having seen data from operators, right, tied to endangered fish. Sometimes, so some operators are already trying to minimize their freshwater use. If we add on top of that, is that even feasible? And then as Rick noted, there's contracts, right, with certain operators and municipalities or whoever. So I do think that data collection and developing pilot projects is feasible. But yeah, I just want you all to know that there are operators that develop oil and gas resources in the same basin, in the same specific area, and each well requires, not necessarily, but sometimes they're very different with how much water they require to fully develop that well.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, John.
So Ryan, University of Colorado Boulder. 8 years ago, our research project made a connection with Symposia and Darko, who were doing a thing called Energy Water Initiative. Did any of you industry folks remember that? And I got to go to a special meeting there on the 50th floor of the Chevron building. Hopefully privileged, but the four things they came up with, as they called the water management trend, was developing fracturing chemistry to use non-freshwater sources, working on treatment to get water better for reusing, and scrolling through to make sure I get them all. Improving water conveyance, pipelines instead of trucks, and improving water storage, having, you just store a large amount of water, you're actually going to be able to reuse it on site. I guess I was wondering, like, from an industry perspective, what came of that? Was it all just deemed, I don't know, we're talking a lot about standards, but it was all just deemed too expensive to take on as a practice until there is forcing regulation to make it happen?
I don't know if anyone here participated in that or not. Rick?
Did you mention my name?
You had your hand up, I didn't know if you were wanting to answer Joe's question or not.
I'm sorry, please. You know, I have an excuse here. I've been exposed to COVID again. I've got a little brain fog going on. What was the question?
It's okay. We're gonna go to Tricia and start to wrap up here. It's been a long day, and I appreciate everyone's focus and attention. Maybe I'll get you as well. And we're getting close to the end of time here. So.
All right.
I guess, this is Tricia. One thing I was thinking about the pilot project, like what does that look like? And Mike, you brought up some good points. What information is it going to give us? I'm thinking about the pilot project more of not being in the field, but more of a tabletop exercise maybe, so that you can identify for each basin what the roadblocks are, what the solutions are, and what the data gaps are, right? I guess that's kind of how I was thinking about it versus working with an operator and going through the whole process of trying to develop the infrastructure. I mean, that would take years. So just a thought.
Thank you, Wills. I'm just asking a question. This question is just to educate myself. This is to oil and gas. So I'm hearing a lot of talk around drilling and water and how much we are getting out of these drills. Is there a way, I don't know, so my question is, like, sometimes you go and drill into the ground and you may not get any water. And when you go to drill, you're using fresh water to drill, but then you don't pull anything out. is there any way that before you drill, you can say, these are the areas where we can pull water out of? I don't know if I'm making sense, but I wanted to understand that so we can reduce freshwater usage in that way, but I don't know if I'm saying a good question or not.
Mark? Yeah, thanks, Ed, Mark. Yeah, I think we have pretty good geological information as we develop material with what that anticipated water line is. So, I think we can factor that into our overall recycling plans as we develop it. Again, it's varied by area and basin and all that, but given any specific area, it's fairly well understood.
And I guess just to tack on your thing, to clarify, are you asking when we drill in an area, is there water available to use in that area?
The water that's in the ground.
Yeah, that you're pulling up, right?
So
Yeah.
in northeastern Colorado, so I won't classify all the basins, but it's a fairly dry formation from a water standpoint that we're accessing for oil and gas minerals. So typically the water that we're receiving back up is the water we've used to hydraulically fracture those wells. In the process of going down to those formations, we're building pipe casing infrastructure to protect the aquifer. And unless there is an improved water supply in that area that allows us to access that aquifer, typically we're creating an isolation and protection for it, and we're not using any of that water. We're only using that deep formation water, which is classified as the produced water, and a majority of that is the water that we're using in that hydraulic fracturing process.
Okay, all right, so then my next question is, I think Rick had mentioned earlier about like how if there's other basins near, somebody else mentioned that we can do like a poly system, right? Would that have an like bad effect if like mixing like different companies reproduce water? Like, is it the same chemicals in the water, or do we have to worry about testing different water pools before we mix? Will that create a problem, teaming up with other companies, adding those waters together?
There's a good process in place to do that in large part, and West Slope has really taken an advance in that, where several operators do share water, that produced water. They do their own testing to make sure that the quality meets their individual needs, but they are doing that, and some of the comments have reflected water sharing agreements, and that's what we want to continue to advance, that opportunity to share with others when we have that ability to use that lower quality water. We want to do it all within the framework of Colorado water rights and making sure that we have the legal right to do that, but as long as we can, we definitely want to repurpose it and share using it.
I just want to add on to that real quick, but this is what the companies do all the time with oil and gas. They come and they add different trucks and different companies into an oil train to move it down. And then they'll do it at a LAC station and put it all on a pipeline to carry it through. There just has to be testing before it gets on and certain thresholds that allow you to put your product on for quality and safety. And that way, you know, your pool is all, no one peed in it too much.
Amber, last question.
With that statement, mine is just a statement. So basins are different, and I know we're all understanding that. And I just wanted to talk about the San Juan Basin for a quick second and know that it's a declining basin, and so the water production out there is not as, the volumes aren't as high as other places. So just when we do go into making these September rules, I think that we should have a little bit of variability, like Commissioner Pinter said, because of those declining basins. And I don't know the rest of the state, but there might be other areas that are declining too. And we can't help that. That's just nature. Thank you.
Well done. That was a super challenging, messy, hard conversation, like all over the place. And I think we did it with grace, we did it with respect. We appreciate the honesty that folks shared. And I hope that we can continue this conversation into July. And what I'm going to ask everyone to do between now and the July meeting is to take this kind of messy conversation that we just had, and at least from your perspective, your individual perspective, from your seat's perspective, start to refine that into something that is a more clear direction that we can provide hope to the staff. And what does that look like as we start to contemplate that last deliverable for 2024 around short and long-term goals and recommendations for an ECMC rulemaking? And what does that look like from your seat? And so that the next time we do this, again, we're not going to come up with all the answers necessarily, but we're going to be able to provide clear direction to hope and the rest of the staff on how to accomplish this over a 2-month period so that we can provide relatively clear recommendations to ECMC at some point in September. Rick, did you have a question?
I just want to clarify what you mean by, or define short-term and long-term. So like, short-term would be within 6 months.
That's up to you.
Okay.
So I'm reading that from legislation, right? That's as defined as it is.
John, can you repeat that for those online question? I think anyone heard the question.
Oh, sorry, Rick and Clay and those online. The question that Michelina asked was for me to define short and long-term goals, which I chose not to do. And rather, I think that that's something that we're going to have to individually define as we think about this, because it's not specific in the legislation, nor defined in the legislation. So thanks again. I'm not even going to say it. No comments. I do want to give it to Hope to say a few things. I really want to thank you to both Greg and Arthur for presenting here today, for all the work that we've done, for everyone else that was involved in helping put this all together, Aaron and Hope. And Emma, thank you, and Adams County for hosting us. We really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I love having anyone in Adams County to come visit us, and thank you for the online people who got to see our lovely conference room, though not much else. If anyone would like to walk around or get a tour of some of the descriptions of what we do in human services, be happy to host. And on your way up, we do have an interactive exhibit for children and also you, anyone experiencing stress, where there's a virtual projection on the ground and you can stomp out some bubbles. And it's an interactive display. I should have brought it up during breaks, or none of you would have ever come back. But you could go up and you could experiment with that virtual projection on the floor where you can pop the bubbles. So, or get a tour, or just thank you for visiting.
With that, the meeting's adjourned, and next meeting, Hope, or any final comments from you?
No, thank you all for giving us plenty of work to do. And I will see you July 12th online. I don't know the time yet, definitely 9 to 1, but we might extend it based on some feedback that we've received. So thank you all, safe travels.
What kind of questions did you keep?